act with the Spirit of Christ to welcome all people and to put God's vision of justice and peace into practice. We seek through prayer, study, and action to co-create with God a world where all people and creation thrive and live in the fullness of life. So this morning, will you join me in worship, prepare ourselves to do this work, and start by reading the call to worship, which is responsive. If you read what's in bold, I will read the rest. The psalmist tells us to be still before God, to wait patiently, to not fret over those who carry out evil devices, to refrain from anger, and to forsake wrath. Jesus tells us to love our enemies, do good to those who hate us, bless those who curse us, pray for those who abuse us. Jesus says, if anyone strikes you on the cheek, offer the other also. If anyone takes your coat, give them your shirt as well. For how long, O God, we are tired of being struck and mocked. Jesus says, do not judge, do not condemn, but love your enemies. Forgive them, do good, and lend to them, expecting nothing in return. For how long, O God, for we stay silent forever? Would you have killed for our blood to cry out from the ground? Would you have us stay mute for the stones to speak of our wrath? Yet a little while, says the psalmist, and the wicked will be no more, and those who wait for God shall inherit the land. O God, who is kind to the ungrateful and to the wicked, hasten the day of your perfect justice, for we are tired of waiting. Transform enemy into neighbor, the wicked into those who are righteous, so that your land may know peace, so that your creation may know reconciliation. Please rise in body and our spirit as we sing our opening hymn, number 388. Help us accept each other. As you're already standing, please go and pass the peace to one another. And be it a wave or a fist bump, to those of you online, peace be with you. Peace, Dad. Peace, Connie. Peace, Ruth. Peace, Christina. Peace, Matthew.
Say hi to the online people.
Hey, Jim. Peace.
Peace.
Peace, guys.
You may be seated. And our scripture this morning is from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 6, verses 27 through 38. Kelly, if you wouldn't mind reading.
But I say to you that listen, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who abuse you. If anyone strikes you on the cheek, offer the other also. And from anyone who takes away your coat, do not withhold even your shirt. Give to everyone who begs from you. And if anyone takes away your goods, do not ask for them again. Do to others as you would have them do unto you. What credit is that to you? For even sinners love those who love them. If you do good to those who do good to you, what credit is that to you? For even sinners do the same. If you lend to those from whom you hope to receive, what credit is that to you? Even sinners lend to sinners to receive as much again. But love your enemies, do good and lend, expecting nothing in return. Your reward will be great, and you will be children of the Most High, for he is kind to the ungrateful and the wicked. Be merciful, just as your Father is merciful. Do not judge, and you will not be judged. Do not condemn, and you will not be condemned. Forgive, and you will be forgiven. Give, and it will be given to you. A good measure, pressed down, shaken together, running over, will be put into your lap. For the measure you give will be the measure you get back.
Word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. Love your enemies. That is the key message in this passage. If you take nothing else away from today's sermon, remember Jesus' words. Love your enemies. Modern scholars, Jewish and Christian alike, identify the love of enemies as the defining characteristic of Jesus' message. For instance, Pinchas Lapid, a Jewish theologian and Israeli historian, writes that, quote, gloating, hatred of enemies, and returning evil for evil are forbidden in Judaism, while generosity and loving deeds toward the enemy in need are commanded. But Judaism does not have the love of enemies as a moral principle. This imperative is probably the only one in all the 3 chapters of the Sermon on the Mount that lacks a clear parallel or analogy in rabbinic literature. It is, in the terminology of theologians, material specific to Jesus, end quote. The love of enemies as a moral principle is material specific to Jesus. So if that's the case, we would do well to reflect on its meaning as those who follow him. Let's start with a little background on this passage. It's part of what's known in Luke's gospel as the Sermon on the Plain. Likely written between 80 and 90 CE, it doesn't get as much attention as the Sermon on the Mount, recorded in Matthew's gospel. Though much of its content is similar, Luke's version has different features and emphases. This is due, at least in part, to Luke's audience being different from Matthew's. Some among Luke's community, like the most excellent Theophilus to whom Luke's gospel is addressed, are of relatively high social standing. They're an audience with more capital, both social and material, and it makes their response to enemies somewhat different than Matthew's audience's response. So Matthew's audience, which consisted mostly of Jews who converted to Christianity, has the memory of the defeat of the great Jewish revolt against the Romans and the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE very much in mind. For Luke's audience, however, those memories of rebellion and oppression by Rome do not carry the same weight, as Luke's audience consisted mainly of Greeks, Gentiles, and Hellenistic Jews who converted to Christianity. So with different audiences and different kinds of threats and enemies facing them, Luke and Matthew tailor Jesus' words to fit the needs of their respective peoples, leading to differences between the Sermon on the Plain and the Sermon on the Mount. One example of these differences is Jesus' advice that if, quote, anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go also the 2nd mile. This saying is found in Matthew, but not in Luke, and it might ring a bell to those of you who read Walter Wink's book, Engaging the Powers. It signifies that Matthew's community was subject to forced labor by the occupying Roman forces, who could impress people, compel them to carry their packs, the soldiers' packs with all their equipment, for up to 1 mile. But concern with forced labor doesn't appear in Luke. His audience is in a less precarious position than Matthew's. Instead of speaking to those who are persecuted, as Matthew does, Luke speaks to those who are abused. The Greek word means threatened or scolded or cursed, which, while not forced labor, was still a serious matter in a world where blessings, curses, and abusive speech were perceived to have real power. Furthermore, the response of those abused in Luke is different from that of those persecuted in Matthew. Rather than limiting their response to prayer, as recorded in Matthew's gospel, in Luke's, Jesus exhorts his listeners to not only pray for their enemies, but also to do good by them. The greater wealth, the greater influence of Luke's audience allows them to respond to their enemies in different ways than were possible for Matthew's, which explains why Jesus in Luke tells the hearers not only to love and pray for their enemies, but also to lend and give away their possessions. Despite the different circumstances of Matthew's and Luke's communities, the essential message of Jesus remains the same. Love your enemies. And that love, in both Luke and Matthew, has the power to transform, so that enemies become neighbors and strife becomes peace. For us, too, Jesus' words are relevant. For many, they still shock our sensibilities. Despite our being in a very different situation and environment from those ancient Christians who first heard Jesus' words, they are still relevant to us today. And I think it is inevitable that the way we respond to them will depend on our own social standing, who we identify with, and who we oppose. So first, let's figure out where we stand and discern who our enemies are. My understanding is that Jesus was and is on the side of the oppressed. As a Palestinian Jew under Roman occupation, he identified with those who were persecuted. As one who was crucified, he died as an enemy of the authorities, those who kept the imperial machine running. But here's an issue. Not everyone who hears Jesus' words can identify with the oppressed. Sure, their hearts might be with them, but their material and social interests are not. In fact, they might find it easier to identify with the conqueror, the cultured Roman colonists, rather than the conquered, the largely peasant class of Jews living in Palestine. So what does it mean to hear Jesus' words when one is the conqueror, a member of the occupying force, or even the descendant of colonists who settled and pacified a land like the United States, be it through extraordinary violence? Who are their enemies and why? Those who identify with the occupying force probably won't care much for Jesus' words. As much as they do care for them, it will likely be because they assume Jesus preaches passivity in the face of violence, and they will take comfort in the assumption that the Messiah of the downtrodden doesn't prescribe much of anything that will threaten their power. They will be happy to hear nonviolence, non-resistance, and pacifism preached because they don't see much in them that constitute a threat, at least not in how these ideas are popularly understood. Those who identify with the occupying forces are also likely to view their enemies as those who want to redistribute the occupied land and the goods and resources that those who labor on it produce. In the US context, I would say those would be the pro-labor, pro-union movement, pro-reparations, Occupy Wall Street, tax the rich, anti-monopoly, pro-heavy investment in public goods and welfare types. Yes. Dale agrees. Good. Enemies would also include those who question the use of armed forces at home and abroad to secure the property and material interests of those who have the most of these things. At home, where property is largely secured through our police and prisons, enemies would include the defund, police, abolish, ICE, prison, abolitionist types. Abroad, where material interests are largely secured through an expansive network of military bases, armed conflicts in far-flung places like Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria, enemies would of course be foreign opposition forces, but also those at home who by and large oppose war and imperialism. Now, one might notice that those who jeopardize the material and political dominance of the elite, who destabilize the status quo, appear weak. Not in a cultural or spiritual sense, but materially, politically, they are quite weak. Amazon, Walmart, Uber constantly crush organized labor. Big pharma and big insurance, with their political allies, defeat efforts for robust public health care. Big banks, private prisons, military contractors thrive, while those the powers rule over lack food, clean water, jobs, healthcare, housing, education, political influence, and more. Now then is a good time to ask, are my enemies among the weak, or are they among the strong? If you're like me, who by historical accident, or maybe the not so accidental actions of my forebears, you find yourself among the victors, amongst those who won the wars, reaped the spoils, occupied the land. If you find yourself there, not necessarily on account of where your heart is, but by virtue of where your material interests lie, you might notice that our enemies are those marginalized by society, They are the weak by many measures. Now you might want to protest, like me, and say, wait, those aren't my enemies. Those are my friends. I'm on their side. But in the meantime, their material interests, by and large, don't align with my own. My cultural circumstances and social expectations would likely have to change significantly. And by not allying with them, I can continue to live quite comfortably with our society more or less the way it is. Meaning, if I'm being honest, that their goals, their interests are largely opposed to my own. But wait, I really am sincere. My heart is with them. Jesus' words really do have meaning for me. They're not a pacifier, they're a catalyst. If that really is the case for you, then go ahead and prove it. And here's one approach that I think is biblically sound. Go ahead and recognize that history and circumstance has made the weak your enemies. Now go and love them as Jesus commanded. How? By doing good by them, recognizing that their hate is a righteous wrath. By blessing them, recognizing that curses that sound like F the police or F the rich are voiced by those who have borne the wrath of these forces beyond the breaking point. By praying for them and not resisting their militancy. God forbid that our person be harmed, but if our possessions are demanded of us, giving them freely and lending with abandon, knowing that too much of our wealth has their lifeblood mixed in with it already. By being merciful and not judging when their advocacy goes against our sensibilities, not condemning them when they break laws meant to protect property and status of those in power, forgiving rather than imprisoning, and yes, giving even more, so that if they do not take what is theirs, we can freely give, such that they have bread to eat, water to drink, a decent job to work, medical care to keep them healthy, a house to keep them sheltered, funding to keep their schools vibrant, and the means to full political and legal participation in our democracy. Go ahead, acknowledge who your enemies are, just treat them with love, like Jesus said. And if we do this right, we might find ourselves identifying with our enemies in a very real and not just sentimental way. We might carry this command out so well that we ourselves start lacking in material goods. If so, and we find ourselves in the shoes of our one-time enemy, we've done well. If we carry out this command so that we share bread, water, decent jobs, healthcare, housing, education, and political influence with our enemies, and we do so in a way that we can all enjoy these things, so much the better. We've not only carried out the command well enough that we are no longer distinguished from our enemies, we've also carried it out well enough that we can all enjoy the abundance of creation. And that, I think, is truly a vision of God's kingdom. If, however, you do not find yourself among the victors, the dominant, the strong, if you are, like Jesus, among the oppressed, among those under the thumb of an empire, and here's some more good news. Jesus' words are just as powerful and liberating for you. If you're oppressed, you know that your enemies are formidable, that they have no trouble with domination. But check this out. Jesus' proverb about the other cheek, where he tells us to turn it after being struck, isn't a call to passivity. It's a call to provocation, a la Gandhi, a la Martin Luther King. who unmasked the complete brutality of their enemies, who exposed that brutality the world over. And when evil The Bible scholar Francois Bouvin identifies 4 ways Israel was very much the weak and oppressed in Jesus' day, traditionally responded to its enemies. The first was completely traitorous collaboration. This is the King Herod type, who was a client king of Rome and known for his brutality, epitomized in the gospel story of the massacre of the innocents. Another option was defending God's glory and cleansing the land by force of weapons. This was the attitude of the Zealots, the Jewish political movement that sought to incite the people to rebel against the Romans and took up arms against them. A third option is physical distancing from the enemy, along with apocalyptic dualism and hatred. That was the approach of people like the Essenes, or Essenes, I never know how to say it, who separated themselves from Jerusalem and who, in their concern for cultic purity, demanded every member of the sect to take an oath to hate the evil ones, the Romans. Fourth option was separation of political and religious spheres, along with a pragmatic adaptation and a strong consciousness of their own status as God's chosen people, expressed as a preference for one's own sisters and brothers. This is probably the attitude taken by the majority of the Jews living under Roman rule and appears as a moderate approach. But Jesus offers a fifth option, loving one's enemies, that relies neither on ethnic exclusivity, which is typified by Deuteronomy 37, the Lord your God will put all these curses on your enemies and on the adversaries who took advantage of you. And loving your enemies does not rely either on the conception that God hates evil humanity, an idea found in Psalm 5, where the boastful will not stand before your eyes, but you, God, hate all evildoers. Instead, loving your enemies relies on the promise that God first loves us, even when we oppose God, and thus equips us to likewise love our enemies. Hence, we find in Luke's gospel, God is kind to the ungrateful and the wicked, and we are called to be merciful just as our God is merciful. So first, God takes the initiative by loving us. That God does so is manifest in the person of Jesus, who even when being crucified, prayed for his enemies and forgave them. Jesus is the example for us to follow and accompanies us in our efforts to love our enemies. Then Jesus connects this command to a promise that in loving our enemies, we will become children of God, the highest promise that humans can hope for. Thus, verse 35, where the result of loving our enemies is the reward of being children of God the Most High. But even more than individual reward, Jesus calls us to love our enemies in the hope that they will be transformed by the act. That the new attitude of Jesus' disciples to their enemies will cause them to discover that they are being faced by someone who loves them, rather than that offer of unexpected love will shock the system of the enemy, compelling them to step out of their hatred and into the way of the gospel. If we love our enemies, they are no longer our enemies. We hope that in doing so, they no longer see us as their enemies. We believe that in doing so, they may even be reconciled to God. Love, then, is greater than any weapon, for a bomb can destroy the body, but only love can change the soul. Let me conclude by emphasizing that regardless of where you stand and who you identify as your enemy, the exhortation is the same. Love them. If you're closer to the oppressor, love your oppressed enemy so that you are transformed materially and spiritually, so that you join them with your whole heart, mind, body, and spirit in their struggle for freedom. And if you're closer to the oppressed, love your oppressing enemy so that they are transformed materially and spiritually, so that they are shamed into surrender by the recognition of their sinful ways, and so that they are disarmed by the divine love that is channeled through you. And let me emphasize that I do not believe that this is an impossible command. It's a matter of will. Loving one's enemies is not wishful thinking, but the most rational, realistic, last best hope for peace on this earth. It's possible because God has loved us first and equips us to love others. It's urgent and necessary because when tensions flare between the three largest nuclear powers in places like Ukraine and Taiwan, the alternatives are terrible. Please add to this list if I'm missing something, but I think we face either total destruction, where the world goes up in flames in a nuclear holocaust, never-ending conflict, smaller wars that just ease enough tension to avert nuclear disaster, but sacrifice millions of lives in the process. Annihilation in part, where we strike first and totally destroy our enemies, where they do likewise to us. Or, and this is my hope, my prayer, total peace, where we take the first step to exit the spiral of escalation by refusing to treat our enemies as enemies, and they follow suit. And true dialogue becomes possible. No matter where we stand, the call to love our enemies is urgent. Jesus has pointed us the way to peace. May we follow it.
Thank you.
We'll take a few moments to reflect while Jacob and Hans play some music. Then we'll come back together to share reflections on sermon and scripture. There are reflections to share. Please feel free to come forward to do so. And if you're online and would like to share something, feel free to type it into the chat. Floor is open.
As always, thank you, Jonathan, for your always thought-provoking reflection sermons. Thank you to Hans and Jacob for kind of almost perfectly paralleling what was in my head, which is kind of scary, in your music, because I was trying to think about, as I think, the love your neighbors as your friends, as you say, is kind of easy, but love your enemies. Boy, I'm thinking about the bubbles that we all get into here. We talk with people with whom we agree more and more often, or at least I do. I'll own that, and kind of find ways to, I'll own this, sometimes ridicule those with whom we disagree. And that's certainly something I need to work on really, really hard. But I think the enemy is who you identify as being your enemy. And for me, sometimes, I'm looking at the enemy in the mirror, because, I have reaped the benefits of society in large part. Sometimes consciously, sometimes unconsciously. And so I'm not always comfortable with that stance, as I look at myself and look at the things that I have or have easily. And so I think there's a definition of being uncomfortable with yourself to kind of look further and farther and deeper. And you can't unlearn those things that you learn about either yourself or your society or the forces that seek to keep people kind of in their places, and the society that you may be benefiting from, as in often my case. So I think there's that mix-upedness, which is another word that's not a word, that may be a little bit in the music that Hans and Jacob created there. For me, I was kind of going up and down the scales as you were talking. So I'm not concluding anything and maybe making other people dizzy as I go on about this, but it's really kind of being open and trying to make those connections with people and seeing their points of view. And it's just not easy, because your identity keeps shifting from who is your enemy, or and then the next step is, are there any enemies? Am I just fighting something, or am I part of a system and just being ground around? So anyway, I will step off after I've caused everyone else some dizziness, but that's kind of where I am. So thank you.
Well, I was thinking the sermon was called Love Yourself and Love Your Enemy. Then I just looked at it. It says know yourself. But I think either one would do good things. But there are times when it's probably harder to love ourselves than love whoever we consider to be the enemy. Probably most of us have certainly gone through some experiences where we were not encouraged to love ourselves. And it does seem like to love our enemy is more difficult if we don't love ourselves. So, enough.
I have always resisted this idea of loving your enemy. I just think, no, thanks. It's you know, you can stay over there and I'll stay over here and I'm just fine with that. But this sermon, the book we are reading for our book club, many things that have happened here have made me examine that idea. And I finally came to the realization that I did that one time. I loved my enemy. I came to love my enemy. And it was a long, long process where I just made sure my behavior was good. And during that time, much of the time I felt hypocrisy. And that was a struggle because I was being good because you're supposed to be good. But then it changed and that person changed. And then I changed. So it's possible. And I'm going to be examining this a little bit more. So thank you.
I was just going to say that aging gets a bad rap, but one thing that's good about getting older, for me anyway, and I would imagine we're all kind of in the same age group with except for yourself. You know, one thing that I've discovered is that I don't have the energy to hate anybody the way I did when I was younger. And it was never a, you know, like a really angry, bitter hatred that I felt, but it was easier to hang on to that, you know, that anger, those, you know, those feelings of being mistreated. Now that I'm older, I just don't want to waste my, you know, physical or psychic energy on that. And I think that has made it easier for me to not hate my enemies. So I hope that is a factor for all of us as we get older.
I started reading American Dirt and I just couldn't continue because it was so upsetting. And that in that case, the enemy was what we'll call a narco with enormous power. And then we have the war coming, apparently. And so we are supposed to hate the narco groups. And I mean, we're supposed to love them. And we're supposed to love the Russian oligarchy and president who want to create harm. And I would like to see a description of how that is possible. Because those are what's on my mind right now. My son reads a lot of science fiction, and I read a book called Walk Away, which I started reading too, and it's kind of post-apocalyptic. So those are stories about the future after the kind of future that Jonathan is concerned about. And I don't think that I can necessarily get too much out of them, but I'm looking at that. So very interesting subject always. Thank you.
There are no further reflections, then we'll take now time for prayer to prepare ourselves for that. To join in singing, God, listen to your children praying. We'll play it twice through. Invite those who have prayers to come forward. If you're online and have prayers, please feel free to put them in the chat.
Good morning, everybody. I wanted again today to ask for continued prayers for my niece Autumn, who continues to do well. Prayers for Marcia Perry. I haven't spoken online to Marcia this week, but I know that she continues to need our prayers. Continued prayers for just some continued prayers for my brother, whom I asked for prayers for last week. Because of just how hard he's working as a postal carrier, how many hours a week. And he just turned 59 yesterday. So birthday blessings and some prayers for him. God, hear our prayers. I'm sorry, I forgot one that is really important to me. You often hear about my prayers for my students at school. And this week, one of the students, that seventh grader who I have had a pretty special relationship with this year, was asked to leave the school. And this is a child that is struggling with some mental health issues. And unfortunately, the reason she was asked to leave the school was because she had threatened another teacher more than once. And this is a side of her I have never even seen. I've never seen this. I've seen this really sweet, loving girl that, is interested in a lot of things, is smart and can talk about anything. So I would really like to ask for some prayers for her, that whatever issues she is having mental health wise can be treated in an appropriate way, and that to help her to go on to live a good and happy and successful life. God, hear our prayers.
I have a prayer of thanks for neighbors who help neighbors. I was stuck on the ice a couple times these past couple weeks, and there's a couple of young men on my street. I called both of them, and both of them said, "I'll be right there." And that is so incredible to me, that people will just drop what they're doing and come in and help you. And these people, we know each other because of a neighborhood association, an association that I actually started in 2009. The Block Club that has grown. And so the book that we're reading talks about, you need to not just be by yourself. You need to do things in a group. You need to join together. And when you join together, this kind of thing happens. You can call somebody and they come and get you out of the ice. So, thank you.
Let's take a time of silence for those prayers, too deep for words. And we'll continue saying the prayer that Jesus taught us in prayer with persons in recovery. God, for good neighbors, we give you thanks for support when alone. We ask for your comfort at times when we are in need of healing of the body and spirit. Pray that your healing presence washes over us. For minds that are troubled and hearts that are unstilled, we pray that your peace may come. And hear us as we continue to pray the prayer that Jesus taught us, saying, Our Father, Mother, who art in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts, as we forgive the debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For yours is the kingdom, and power, and glory forever. Amen. And continuing in prayer with persons in recovery, we say, Our Mother, Father, within and among us, abundant are your forms. May new day come, our spirits one with the earth, as yours is among us. Give us this day our daily abstinence, and forgive us our relapses, as we forgive ourselves, one day at a time. And lead us not into temptation, but help us walk our paths. For ours is the earth to tend and cherish, power and spirit, forever blessed be. Amen. Special music. Before we get to our special music, I do want to invite you all to a time of offering. Feel free to contribute both of time, money, spirit, prayer, whatever you have to give to this church, to the world at large. And Kathy, come around with our offering plate. Please rise for the doxology.
Praise God, the Word who came to earth. Praise God, the Spirit, holy flame. All glory, honor to God's name. Amen.
Our special music this morning from Hans and Jacob is Peace I Leave With You, my friends. Are there any announcements for the good of the whole? Yes, Joan.
Kathy and I attended a meeting of the Ward 14 Pastors and Faith Leaders Collaborative this week, and it's an organization that was started when our councilwoman, Jasmine Santana, reached out to the churches. And if anybody wants more information about this, please see me. They are looking for a couple representatives from each church to do a one-year commitment of monthly meetings and a couple activities each month. But for more information, see me, please.
I have a couple of announcements, but just to add to what Joan said, I've been at several of those meetings, both with Joan and Kathy in the past of their events. And that is a really great organization for us at Archwood to remain connected to the community. Because one of the things I learned was how different Archwood is in many ways, the church structure. From the churches we see in the community. Many of these churches are storefront churches. Very many are Spanish speaking, but they are doing really very good work. And, you know, there's a lot of outreach, and I just think it's I don't have the time now either, but anybody that is interested, it's a really worthy cause and can really keep us connected. So, I wanted to say that we are having a governing body meeting directly following worship. So governing body members, please hang around. That's our pre-budget meeting. And for everyone else, our congregational meeting will be next Sunday, immediately following worship. Oh, is that next? Oh, that's 2 weeks. I'm sorry. I apologize. I have my weeks wrong. 2 weeks, March 6th, right? Yeah, March 6th, immediately following worship. To discuss and approve the budget. And finally, March 2nd is Ash Wednesday, and we will be having an Ash Wednesday service with the imposition of ashes, but we will also be online. And for anyone that, I know we have a few people that, like Connie and Ruth, that join us online every week, and we're, it's great to have more people online this week. If anyone is interested, there are great videos online about preparing your own ashes. If you are at home and you want to do that for yourself, because I am this year preparing our ashes, excuse me, from palms from the last time that we actually were in person in church. So it's pretty easy and it's pretty interesting. So thank you.
A couple of updates. Hula de Burgos has received now 2 offers for the property insurance that is, they've been waiting for to actually complete the transfer of the building. And so they should be able to decide which one they want to use. The one of them is from the company we have used and are using, and another one. The second thing is the door situation. I don't know if this door is on a ship that's stuck in a canal or has gone on fire, but it is expected not to arrive until June. So that is when apparently the door will actually be able to be put in.
Okay. And maybe finally, we had talked about not being strangers or not seeing strangers. So again, the book See No Strangers by Valerie Cower. We will begin that book club tomorrow. And that will be at 7:30. There is a Zoom link both in the e-blast that comes out weekly, so always look for it there, as also the link here. It's different, so just as a heads up for people. And if you need the Zoom link, or you need the book, or you would like to tune in and you're not sure you need to read the book, any of that is possible. We just welcome people to Zoom with us 7:30 tomorrow, and it's going to be every Monday until we finish. The first chapter and the introduction are tomorrow. Thanks to Hans, and also thanks to Dale, who I actually sent out some links from Hans and some wonderful reflective questions from Dale, who I'm sure will give us even more of his wisdom tomorrow night, not any pressure. But certainly join us and be welcome whether you read the book or not. This is about seeing no strangers, so don't be one.
And one more announcement. Next week, we have a produce sale. Our closing hymn this morning is number 170, Your Ways Are Not Our Own. And please rise as you're able. May God bless you and keep you. May God's face shine upon you. May God be gracious unto you and give you peace. May that peace flow from you to the enemy, neighbor alike, and yes, even to yourself as you love. Go in peace.